Now moving on, Colin Pitchfork, the rapist and murderer who killed 2 schoolgirls in 1988, is staging a fresh bid for freedom, having won an appeal for another parole hearing. Barbara Ashworth, the mother of one of his victims, has expressed anger at the decision, saying they should throw away the key. Joining me now, Conservative MP for South Leicestershire, Alberto Costa, who's campaigned for whole life sentences. Alberto, good to have you with us. It sickens us all when we read these kind of stories that somebody who could have committed such horrendous, such horrific crimes against 2 young girls could even be considered for release. But the way the story goes, as I'm sure you're aware, he wasn't given a whole life tariff, so therefore he's entitled to a parole hearing.
Well, he may be entitled to apply for parole, but that doesn't mean he's entitled to be granted parole. Let's never forget that people, even though he was convicted under a different criminal law regime, if he were to be granted release, it's release on licence. The story of Colin Pitchfork has at its centre, and we must never forget this, the loss of 2 young women, Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. And all viewers no doubt feel for the families and friends of Linda and Dawn. I've lost count of the number of constituents, particularly women of my age. I'm 53. I'm roughly the age that Linda and Dawn would be today if they hadn't been murdered. But I've lost count of the number of women that have approached me over the years and said, thank you very much, Mr. Costa, as MP for South Leicestershire. Keep this campaign going. Please keep raising the concerns that Colin Pitchfork presents to the public. And I think, Ian, there's 2 issues here. One is the Pitchfork case itself, and the second is a wider issue of the parole board. On Pitchfork himself, this is a man that went into prison at the age of 28, and he was released as a middle-aged fit man at the age of 61. This isn't an elderly man with a terminal illness. This is a fit, middle-aged man who has decades of life ahead, of working life ahead. He was released in 2021, only to be recalled back in 2 months later. And the parole board last spring had another parole hearing and determined wrongly that he should be released. I appealed to the Secretary of State for Justice, who listened, and applied to the parole board for them to reconsider the matter, which they did. And they concluded only 2 months ago that Colin Pitchfork should not be released on the grounds that he could not demonstrate that his attitude towards women had changed. So this is a man that still presents a danger to the public. And rather bizarrely, we had it confirmed yesterday that Colin Pitchfork's application to be released has been approved and that a new parole board hearing will take place to listen and hear his application. He's now arguing that it would be irrational not to release him. So it's taken a bizarre twist. And that's why I've issued across South Leicestershire today this survey that has been sent to tens of thousands of households, asking households in South Leicestershire to give me their views on whether the parole board should be reformed, because I think the Pitchfork case highlights a need for a change in how the parole board deals with the most sensitive of cases.
Do you think, Alberto, that it's the parole board that needs reform, or is it somewhere else deeper in the justice system? Lots of us, and I'm sure you would probably concur, would like to have seen this man given a whole life sentence in the first place, and we wouldn't even be discussing parole boards. Is it an absence of more stringent sentences that is central to the problem here?
That's an excellent question, Ian. So we are changing the law. The Conservative government are introducing whole life orders in cases such as Pitchfork. So if Pitchfork was to commit one of his crimes today, he would likely get what's called a whole life tariff. And broadly, that means that an individual would spend most, if not all, of their natural life in prison, regardless of whether they've been rehabilitated. So we have changed the law, and we're in the process of doing that, because the way in which we view sexual offences, murder against, in particular, women, is different from the way that we did in the past. But the second issue that you raise is, who should be reformed. And changing the criminal law is just one step. The added change is to the parole board system itself. It cannot be right that we had a parole board hearing where Pitchfork was deemed safe enough to be released to the public. Then we had, in effect, an appeal against that by the Secretary of State for Justice at my request, and the appeal, in effect, rejected the original decision by the parole board and upheld the Secretary of State for Justice's submissions that it would be irrational to release him. And so the parole board only determined that in December of last year. And now the parole board is accepting Mr. Pitchfork's application to appeal the appeal. This has become bizarre, and that's why there needs to be a tweaking to the parole board rules to ensure that they're not abused by prisoners, in effect seeking limitless appeals to decisions that are made against them.
Can anybody make their points known to a parole board if they consider or believe they have evidence, for whatever reason, that somebody could be dangerous upon release? Are they able to in any way get that across to the parole board? Is the whole thing held in such secret isolation that only a select few around the table get a say in this? How does that work? I think it's an area most of us know very little about.
Well, you're right, and that's another issue that I've been long campaigning about. So if you're charged with an offence and you go through the criminal court process, it's an open forum. It's open to the media to report, and it's open to members of the public to attend and hear the evidence presented against an accused. And yet when we come to the end of the criminal justice system, when a prisoner applies to be released on licence, the whole process is shrouded in secrecy. It's wholly opaque and totally lacking in transparency. And therefore, the question that you pose is, should the parole board system be fundamentally reformed that it becomes an open forum so all of us can hear the evidence presented by a prisoner as to why a prisoner ought to be released on licence? And I think, Ian, you're right. You've hit the nail on the head. That is the problem with our system. Yeah. Now, for most cases, the parole board seems to get the right answer, but it's the ones that are the most sensitive, the most egregious. For example, the case of John Warboys. Viewers might remember that case only 4 or 5 years ago, where the black cab rapist, it was proposed by the parole board to be released. And it was only following public outrage that it was discovered that that individual had indeed assaulted many more women than he'd been convicted of. So you're right. The parole board needs to have reform. It needs to be much more transparent and much more open in its processes.